You know that feeling when a story just doesn't sit right? You can't quite explain why, but something feels off. Well, today, we're going to ditch the old school lie detection stuff. The sweaty palms, the shifty eyes. Instead, we're going to become architects. We're going to analyze the very structure of a story to find its hidden flaws. So, let's grab our hard hats and take a look at the blueprints. And this right here, this is our guiding principle for today. We're shifting the whole conversation away from good or bad intent and focusing on construction. A lie doesn't fall apart because the person telling it is bad. It falls apart because the story they've built is just fundamentally unstable. It has no structural integrity. Exactly. So we're trading in the magnifying glass for an architect's blueprint. We're going to look at how a story is put together, piece by piece. We're looking for cracks in the foundation, illogical support beams, all the telltale signs of a narrative that's built on nothing but itself. Okay, so here's our roadmap. First, we'll lay out this new way of thinking. Then we'll dive into the one foundational flaw that every single lie has. After that, we'll look at the two major symptoms that pop up because of that flaw. And finally, we'll get to the fun part, the exact moment the whole thing comes crashing down. Think of this as learning a whole new language for reading narratives. It's a language that gives us the tools to see not just what's being presented, but to actually see the shape of what's missing. All right, so let's get into it. Every story, whether it's true or false, is basically an attempt to build a stable structure out of information. But here's the thing. Every single deceptive narrative has a fatal flaw at its core, a single point of weakness that the entire lie is built around. We call this flaw the clarity void. The best way to think about it is like a dead zone in the story map or a corrupted file in a computer program. It's not just that a piece of information is missing. Oh no, it's a whole region where the data is so scrambled that getting a clear, logical read becomes totally impossible. This is your number one sign of a manipulated reality. And you can see that contrast right here. A true story has what we call clarity presence. Its structure is solid, it's stable, it makes sense. A lie, on the other hand, is built around that void we just talked about, which makes its structure unstable from the get-go. And sooner or later, that instability leads to something we call a clarity collapse. And this is what that collapse looks like in action. Picture a clean, straight narrative line. The collapse is the moment you hit a patch of digital static. The details get pixelated, they become blurry, they just don't make sense. It's the story's version of a system error, and it's a huge, flashing sign that something is structurally very, very wrong. So if the clarity void is the big foundational flaw, how does it actually show up? Well, it appears as these structural cracks in the story. We're going to focus on the two biggest ones you'll see, the paradox and the absence. First up, let's talk about paradoxical entanglement. This is so fascinating because it's literally a self-made trap. To prop up the lie, the narrator introduces these little details that are connected by a really fragile if-then logic, and that logic ultimately contradicts itself. So here's how that if-then bind gets you. The narrator says, okay, detail A is a fact. But to make A seem believable, they have to introduce detail B as something that must have happened as a result. Something like, if I was at the library, which is detail A, then my phone must have been turned off, which is detail B. The problem is, what if detail B is just impossible? What if phone records show a call was made at that exact time? What you end up with is this. A reference loop. It's a completely closed circular system where A proves B and B proves A, but neither of them has any anchor in reality. The lie is trying to hold itself up by its own bootstraps, and that, my friends, creates a critical system failure. The second sign is a bit more subtle. It's the omission trace. You see, a lie isn't just about what's said. It's so often defined by what's deliberately not said. But when you leave something out, you create a structural hole. And that hole, it leaves behind a trace, almost like an echo of the missing piece. And this is exactly how you can spot those gaps. Just look at this timeline. It's a perfect example of what's called a marked absence. The sequence just jumps from event 3 straight to event 5. So the obvious question is, what was event 4? But the real question, the architectural question is, why is the structure of this story working so hard to hide it? Of course they're going to try and patch over that hole. They'll drop in an omission replacement, something really vague like, oh, I was just sorting some things out, or I got tied up for a bit. But it's a flimsy patch. To a trained eye, the trace of that original omission, that structural gap, is still perfectly visible. So all this brings us to the final phase of our analysis. We've seen the core flaw, we've seen its symptoms, and now we get to the moment where the pressure on that flawed structure just becomes too much, and the whole deceptive narrative finally gives way. And we call this the disambiguation point. This really is the climax of the whole investigation. It's that one specific moment where all the confusion, all the different ways you could interpret the story, suddenly just collapse. And you're left with one single, clear, undeniable reading of what actually happened. See, until this moment, the story has what we call an ambiguity presence. There's some wiggle room, you could see it in a couple of ways. But at the disambiguation point, that ambiguity is just gone. It's eliminated. The blueprint of the lie is laid bare for everyone to see, and the truth is finally forced out into the open. So let's just quickly recap the new tools you have in your analytical toolkit. You can now spot the foundational hole in a story, the clarity void. You can identify the self-defeating logic of a reference loop. You can see the evidence of what's missing in an omission trace. And you can pinpoint that exact moment of collapse, the disambiguation point. And this is where it all ends. It's not a guess, it's not an accusation, it is the observable structural failure of a poorly built story. The collapse isn't just possible, it's inevitable. So that leaves us with a final question for you. We are all swimming in stories every single day, from our friends, from the news, from our leaders. Now that you can see the architecture, what weak foundations and structural flaws are you going to start noticing in the narratives all around you?